Elliot never planned to be at the rooftop that night. If he had, he would have dressed differently, prepared emotionally, maybe even talked himself out of going. But life doesn't usually warn you before it shows you the truth. The elevator doors opened to music, laughter, and the warm glow of city lights stretching endlessly in every direction. The rooftop was packed. Suits, dresses, champagne glasses lifted in celebration. A successful crowd, a confident crowd. And standing at the center of it all was Daniel Hayes. Elliot felt the familiar pull in his chest, the reflexive smile that came whenever he saw him. Daniel looked effortless. The tailored suit, the relaxed posture, the way people leaned in when he spoke. This was Daniel in his element. This was the version the world knew, the version Elliot helped build. Elliot adjusted the catering tray in his hands and reminded himself why he was here. Work, just work, nothing more. He wasn't supposed to look for Daniel. He did anyway. Have you ever loved someone who made you feel safe in private, but invisible in public? And tell us where you're watching from. I'll be reading every comment. And if you believe that quiet strength always outlasts arrogance, make sure you subscribe now, because this story isn't about revenge, it's about patience, dignity, and consequences. 6 years earlier, they met on a quiet afternoon that smelled like rain and old paper. A bookstore cafe. One table left. 2 strangers reaching for the same chair. Daniel had laughed then, a soft, surprised laugh, and said, "Guess the universe wants us to talk." Elliot had smiled, not knowing that sentence would define the next chapter of his life. They talked for hours. About ambition, about fear, about how exhausting it was to always be performing a version of yourself that felt safer for other people. Daniel admitted, quietly, "I'm not out at work. Not really. I don't know if I ever will be." Elliot didn't push, didn't judge. He said, "Everyone gets there in their own time." He meant it. The first years were easy. They cooked late-night meals together, argued about books, fell asleep mid-conversation. Daniel held Elliot like someone who was afraid of losing him. But even then, there were boundaries. No photos, no office events, no family gatherings. "It's just for now," Daniel would say. "I promise." Elliot believed him, not because he was naive, but because love teaches you to negotiate with yourself. Back on the rooftop, Elliot paused near the bar as Daniel's laughter cut through the air. Someone asked a casual question, the kind people ask when they're relaxed and curious. "So Daniel, are you seeing anyone?" Elliot felt his breath slow. He told himself not to listen. Daniel smiled, took a sip of his drink, and said, "No, I'm single." Then he laughed, not nervously, not carefully, comfortably. The sound hit Elliot harder than any insult ever could, because it wasn't cruelty, it was ease. Elliot stood very still. The city lights blurred slightly, though he hadn't realized his eyes had filled. Around him, people continued laughing, talking, celebrating. No one noticed him. That was the worst part. Daniel didn't look around, didn't hesitate, didn't search the room. In that moment, Elliot understood something painful and irreversible. Daniel didn't fear losing him. Daniel feared being seen. Elliot didn't confront him. That would have been easier. Instead, he stayed. He watched Daniel move through the crowd, confident and admired, watched how easily he belonged to a version of life where Elliot didn't exist. And then, quietly, Elliot finished his shift. He rode the elevator down, alone. That night, Elliot went home and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He replayed conversations, promises, late-night reassurances. "You matter to me. I'm just not ready. Please understand." Understanding, Elliot realized, had slowly become erasure. He packed carefully, not in anger,
not dramatically. He folded shirts, collected documents, backed up files on a drive Daniel had never asked about. When morning came, Elliot left the apartment key on the table. No note, no goodbye. Daniel would wake up to silence, the same silence he had practiced perfecting for years.
Daniel noticed the absence late that afternoon. At first, it felt like relief, space, control. Then it felt unfamiliar. By evening, it felt wrong. Elliot didn't respond to texts. By night, Daniel told himself Elliot was overreacting. "He'll come back," he said aloud to an empty room. He didn't realize that Elliot hadn't left to be chased. He had left to stop disappearing. And somewhere between that rooftop laugh and the quiet click of a closing door, the balance of power shifted, silently, completely. Daniel just didn't know it yet. Daniel woke up alone the next morning and told himself not to panic. The apartment was too quiet, but that wasn't unusual. Elliot often left early. Meetings, site visits, consultations, work that Daniel never fully understood and never felt the need to question. Daniel checked his phone. No message. He frowned, more annoyed than concerned. Elliot had always been the one who checked in, the one who remembered schedules, reminders, anniversaries, the emotional infrastructure of their life together. Daniel stood, stretched, and walked into the bathroom. Elliot's toothbrush was gone. That was when irritation turned into discomfort.
At first, Daniel assumed it was a tactic. Elliot had done this before. Disappeared emotionally, withdrawn into himself when something hurt him. He would go quiet for a day or two, then return with an apology he never owed. Daniel relied on that pattern more than he realized. "He just needs space," Daniel muttered, staring at his reflection. He dressed, grabbed his keys, and went to work. Elliot, meanwhile, sat in a small rented apartment across town. Sparse, clean, temporary. He hadn't slept much. Not because he was spiraling, because his mind was finally quiet enough to organize. Elliot opened his laptop and began working through folders he hadn't touched in years. Contracts, compliance reports, risk assessments. He wasn't looking for revenge, he was looking for closure. And closure, for Elliot, meant understanding exactly what he had given and what had been taken.
6 years earlier, Daniel had been brilliant but reckless, ambitious, charismatic, impatient. Elliot had seen it immediately. That was why he helped, quietly, carefully, without ever attaching his name. When Daniel joined Hayes & Co. Consulting, Elliot reviewed contracts for him late at night, flagged risks, simplified clauses, suggested alternative language. Daniel always said the same thing: "You're a genius. I don't know what I'd do without you." Elliot never corrected him. He never said, "You're standing on more support than you realize." Back at the office, Daniel's day moved fast. Meetings, emails, laughter, but something felt off. A partner postponed a one-on-one they'd scheduled weeks ago. An associate avoided eye contact. A client asked pointed questions about internal accountability. Nothing alarming, just unfamiliar. Daniel told himself he was imagining it. That evening, Daniel called Elliot. Straight to voicemail. He texted, "You didn't have to disappear like this." No response. He waited an hour, then sent another. "We need to talk." Still nothing. Daniel felt the first stirrings of anger. How dare Elliot shut him out like this, after everything Daniel had given him, after the life they'd built? Daniel didn't consider how often Elliot had swallowed discomfort to keep that life stable. He didn't consider how many times Elliot had chosen patience over dignity. He just felt abandoned. Elliot spent the evening reviewing an old file labeled H&C Preliminary Review. He almost smiled. Years ago,
Hayes and Cole had requested an external risk overview. Elliot had completed it as an independent consultant under a shell entity. The firm never followed up. But the work still existed, and more importantly, so did the record of it. Elliot didn't plan to send it to anyone. Not yet. But he updated his notes, quietly.
The next few weeks passed strangely. Daniel noticed patterns forming. He was excluded from 2 meetings he normally led. A junior partner took over a client presentation without explanation. HR circulated a memo about conduct and representation. Daniel laughed it off. Companies loved buzzwords. He focused on being visible, being confident, being himself. That was his second mistake. At a networking dinner, Daniel drank too much wine and talked too freely. Someone asked about work-life balance again. Daniel smirked. "People think privacy makes you interesting," he said. "In reality, it just means you're hiding something." The table laughed. Daniel leaned back, pleased with himself. He didn't notice the silence that followed, or the way one woman at the table quietly took note.
Elliot, meanwhile, met with someone he trusted. Not a lawyer, not a manager, a former colleague, someone who understood systems. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," Elliot said calmly. "I just want to make sure I'm protected." The colleague nodded. "Protection often looks like preparation," she replied. They talked for an hour. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. Daniel finally returned home late one night and noticed something else missing. The framed photo on the shelf, the one from their vacation where Daniel insisted they pose separately. Gone. The couch cushion Elliot always sat on, undented. The apartment felt staged, like a place someone used to live. Daniel sat down and felt something unfamiliar creep in. Fear, not of losing Elliot, of being misunderstood.
He called Elliot again. This time, Elliot answered. Daniel exhaled in relief. "Where are you?" Daniel asked. "Safe," Elliot replied. Daniel frowned. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." There was no anger in Elliot's voice, just distance. "We should talk," Daniel said. "We are," Elliot replied calmly. Daniel opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain, to minimize, to justify. Elliot spoke first. "I heard you say you were single." Silence. Daniel swallowed. "That's not what you were supposed to hear." Elliot nodded, though Daniel couldn't see it. "That's the point."
Daniel rushed to respond. "You know why I said it. You know how things are. You know it doesn't mean you don't matter." Elliot closed his eyes. "I mattered in private," he said. "I disappeared in public." Daniel tried to interrupt. Elliot continued. "I didn't leave because you're not out," Elliot said evenly. "I left because you were comfortable erasing me." Daniel had no answer, because explanations don't undo choices. Elliot ended the call gently. Daniel stared at his phone long after the screen went dark. For the first time it occurred to him, Elliot wasn't angry. He was done. And somewhere in that realization, Daniel made his third mistake. He underestimated what quiet people do once they stop asking to be seen. Daniel told himself he needed to regain control. That was always his instinct, not to reflect, but to recalibrate perception. If something felt off, it meant he needed to adjust how others saw him. He didn't call Elliot again. Instead, he leaned harder into work. Visibility, confidence, performance. He told himself Elliot would come back once he realized how unnecessary the drama was. Daniel had always mistaken emotional labor for dependency. Elliot, on the other hand, had never felt more independent.
His new apartment still smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, but there was something grounding about its emptiness. Nothing here required negotiation. Nothing here demanded he shrink. He set up his desk by the window and opened his laptop. For the first time in years, he worked without interruption. Daniel had never really known what Elliot did. He knew the words, consulting, systems, compliance, but he never asked what that meant in practice. Elliot didn't talk about it much. His work wasn't glamorous, it was precise. Elliot built frameworks that prevented disasters no one ever saw coming, the kind of work that only mattered when something went wrong, and things were beginning to go wrong. 3 years earlier, Elliot had reviewed a proposed expansion for Hayes & Cole. Daniel had been excited then, confident, careless. "This is huge," Daniel had said, pacing the apartment. "We'll double our reach." Elliot had scanned the documents quietly. He remembered the moment clearly, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way he paused longer than usual. "There are risks here," Elliot had said gently. "Regulatory exposure, reputational vulnerabilities." Daniel waved him off. "That's why we have legal." Elliot had nodded. He always nodded, but he wrote notes anyway. Now, Elliot revisited those notes, not because he wanted to use them, because he wanted to understand how deeply he'd been woven into Daniel's success without ever being acknowledged. He scrolled through emails, tracked timelines, cross-referenced decisions. Patterns emerged, not illegal, just careless. And carelessness, Elliot knew, had consequences in the right light. Daniel noticed the light shifting around him. A senior partner stopped inviting him to impromptu lunches. A junior associate hesitated before asking him questions. A long-standing client requested additional oversight. Daniel laughed it off publicly. Privately, he grew tense. He started talking more, explaining himself more, justifying decisions no one had accused him of making. That was mistake number 4. At a company mixer, Daniel found himself telling a story he'd told many times before, about independence, about ambition, about how distractions ruin careers. "Some people want recognition without earning it," Daniel said, sipping his drink. "They confuse support with entitlement." A few people nodded. Others exchanged glances. Daniel didn't notice. He felt validated. Elliot met with a former client that same evening, not to discuss Daniel, not to discuss Hayes & Co., just coffee, just catching up. But people in compliance talk carefully. They ask questions without asking them. "Still doing independent reviews?" the client asked. "Yes," Elliot replied. "Ever cross paths with Hayes & Co.?" Elliot paused, just long enough. "Years ago," he said, briefly. The client nodded. "Interesting." That was all. Daniel began sleeping poorly. He woke up early, mind racing. He replayed conversations, searching for threats that hadn't been spoken. He told himself Elliot was irrelevant now, yet he checked his phone constantly. Still nothing. The silence felt deliberate, calculated. Daniel hated that. One afternoon, Daniel was called into a meeting he hadn't expected. Not disciplinary, not urgent, just formal. 3 partners sat at the table. One smiled politely. "We're doing a standard internal review," she said. "Nothing to worry about." Daniel nodded, heart racing. "Of course." "We just want clarity on decision-making processes," another added, "and external influences." Daniel froze, just for a moment. External influences? He recovered quickly. "Happy to help," he said smoothly, but something had cracked. That night, Daniel went home and poured himself a drink. He stared at the empty couch where Elliot used to sit, legs tucked beneath him, quietly reading while Daniel talked about his day. Daniel had never once asked Elliot how his day went. Not really. He had assumed it wasn't as important. Now he wondered what Elliot had been seeing all along. Elliot received an email marked confidential. It wasn't about Daniel, not directly.
It was a request for an independent compliance opinion, nothing unusual. The client name made him pause, a subsidiary tied to Hayes & Cole. Elliot stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he replied, "Happy to review." He wasn't setting a trap. He wasn't manipulating anything. He was simply stepping back into a system he understood, one that didn't care about charm or excuses, only consistency, only truth. Daniel, unaware, posted a photo that night, a smiling selfie at a trendy restaurant. Caption, "Focused, grateful, unstoppable." The likes came quickly, but something else came too. Silence from people who used to comment first. Daniel didn't realize it yet, but the narrative around him was changing, not loudly, not publicly, but decisively, and Elliot, quietly, was no longer protecting him from it.
Daniel could feel it now. Not as panic, not yet, but as resistance, like walking into a room where the air had thickened just enough to slow you down. It wasn't one thing. It was a pattern. Meetings ended without his input. Decisions were made before he arrived. Conversations shifted when he approached. People were still polite. That was the problem. At Hayes & Cole, Daniel had always been magnetic. Junior associates watched him. Clients trusted him. Partners admired his confidence. But confidence only works when people believe it's backed by substance. And belief, Daniel was beginning to learn, is fragile. The internal review expanded quietly. No announcement, no gossip, just requests, clarifications, timelines, documentation. Daniel answered everything quickly, almost too quickly. He wanted to appear cooperative, indispensable. What he didn't realize was that speed can look like defensiveness when no one is accusing you yet.
Elliot, meanwhile, sat at his desk, reviewing documents that felt strangely familiar. The subsidiary's request was clean, professional, routine. But the material mirrored decisions he'd flagged years ago, risks he'd cautioned against. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt tired. Because this wasn't new, this was delayed. Years earlier, Elliot had tried to explain something Daniel never wanted to hear. "Reputation isn't what you say," Elliot had said once, late at night. "It's what holds up when no one's managing it." Daniel had laughed. "You worry too much." Elliot remembered that moment clearly now. Daniel was invited to another meeting, this one smaller. 3 partners, no smiles. One of them folded her hands. "We've noticed some discrepancies in how certain engagements were framed," she said calmly. Daniel leaned forward. "I can explain." "We're not asking you to," she replied. "We're asking who reviewed them." Daniel paused. There it was, the question he hadn't prepared for. "I handled most of it myself," Daniel said after a beat, "with legal oversight." The partners exchanged glances. "Did you consult externally?" one asked. Daniel shook his head. "No need." That was mistake number 5. Elliot's phone rang later that afternoon, a number he recognized but hadn't heard from in years. "Hi," the voice said cautiously. "We received your preliminary opinion. We had a question." Elliot listened. "Yes," he said. "No," he added, "and that risk existed long before now." There was a pause. "So this wasn't recent?" Elliot chose his words carefully. "I identified it years ago," he said. "It just wasn't addressed." Daniel left the office late that night. The building felt different, colder, quieter. He walked past offices where doors were closed earlier than usual. People were working, just not with him. At home, Daniel poured himself a drink he didn't want. He replayed the meeting again and again. Why had they asked about external review? Why now? His thoughts drifted, unwillingly, to Elliot, to the way Elliot used to pause before speaking, to the notes he took no one ever asked to see. Daniel pushed the thought away. Elliot wasn't part of this. he couldn't be. The next morning, an email circulated internally. Subject, temporary reassignment of client representation. Daniel's name was listed. Not removed, reassigned. It was framed gently. Operational efficiency, broader oversight, alignment. But Daniel read it 3 times. His chest tightened. This wasn't discipline, this was distrust. At lunch, Daniel joined a table of colleagues. The conversation stalled. Someone checked their phone. Someone else excused themselves. Daniel forced a smile. "So," he said lightly, "anyone watching anything good lately?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any confrontation. Elliot walked past the same rooftop venue that evening. Different crowd, different night. He stopped for a moment, watching people laugh under warm lights. He didn't feel bitterness. He felt distance. Distance was safer. Daniel finally broke. He called Elliot again. This time, Elliot answered immediately. "I need to understand what's happening," Daniel said, voice tight. Elliot listened. "I'm losing ground," Daniel continued. "Things are shifting, and I don't know why." Elliot spoke carefully. "Daniel," he said, "have you ever considered that this isn't about me?" Daniel swallowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Elliot continued calmly, "I used to buffer you from consequences you didn't want to see." Silence. Daniel's mind raced. "You're saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying," Elliot replied, "that I stopped standing between you and the truth." Daniel laughed, brittle, defensive. "So what, you're punishing me?" Elliot shook his head, though Daniel couldn't see it. "I didn't punish you," he said. "I stepped away." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to accuse, but something in Elliot's voice, calm, resolved, told him it wouldn't work. After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in the dark. For the first time, he understood something terrifying. Elliot hadn't taken anything from him. Elliot had simply stopped giving, and the difference was devastating. Daniel had always believed that visibility was power. If people saw you enough, heard you enough, trusted your voice, then uncertainty would bend around you. It had worked his entire career. So when the ground beneath him started to shift, Daniel did what he always did. He talked. The reassignment email was only supposed to be temporary. That's how the partners framed it. Just until things settle. But Daniel could feel the weight of the word "until" pressing into every interaction. He began showing up everywhere. Industry dinners, panel discussions, after-work drinks. He laughed louder, spoke longer, positioned himself as indispensable. And in doing so, he forgot the most dangerous rule of reputation. When people are watching closely, every word matters more. At a regional leadership mixer, Daniel stood near the bar, surrounded by mid-level consultants eager to listen. Someone asked casually, "How do you handle stress at your level?" Daniel smiled, confident, practiced. "You have to keep your personal life clean," he said. "No distractions, no emotional noise." A few people nodded. Daniel continued, "I've seen talented people stall because they confuse support with entitlement." There it was again, that word, entitlement. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. Across town, Elliot sat in a quiet cafe, reviewing notes for an unrelated client. He hadn't spoken about Daniel to anyone, not once. He didn't need to. Systems don't move because of gossip. They move because of patterns, and Daniel was creating one. The next misstep came at a private dinner, smaller, more dangerous. Wine flowed freely, voices softened. Someone mentioned the internal review, jokingly. Daniel leaned back, exhaled sharply. "Honestly," he said, "people are too sensitive these days. They want accountability without responsibility." Someone raised an eyebrow.
Daniel didn't notice. You build something, everyone wants credit. You protect something, no one notices. A pause. One person quietly set their glass down. Daniel kept going. He always did. The recording wasn't secret, no phone hidden beneath a table. Someone openly filming a toast. Daniel's voice caught clearly in the background. It circulated quietly, not viral, not dramatic, just available. And availability is enough. Daniel began sensing something he couldn't name. When he spoke, people listened, but not the way they used to. They remembered, they compared, they evaluated. Daniel mistook this for respect. It wasn't. Elliot received a message from a former colleague. "Are you seeing what's happening?" Elliot stared at the screen for a moment, then replied simply, "Yes." Nothing more. Daniel was summoned again, this time without warning. No pleasantries, no easing in. The partner across from him folded her hands. "We're concerned about perception," she said calmly. Daniel stiffened. "Perception?" "Your public comments," she continued, "your tone, your alignment with our values." Daniel laughed reflexively. "I'm just being honest." The partner nodded slowly. Honesty without awareness can still be harmful. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. That was new. They didn't reprimand him. They didn't threaten him. They did something worse. They documented. That night, Daniel called Elliot again. Not angry, not defensive, desperate. "They're painting me as something I'm not," Daniel said. Elliot listened quietly. "Daniel," Elliot replied gently, "people don't paint you. They respond to what you show them." Daniel clenched his jaw. "You're enjoying this," he accused. Elliot exhaled. "No," he said, "I'm surviving it." Daniel wanted to say something cruel, something sharp, but exhaustion won. The call ended unresolved. Elliot stood by his window long after. He didn't feel victorious. He felt sad. Because he remembered the man Daniel used to be. The one who once admitted he was tired of hiding. But people who refuse to grow don't stay still. They calcify. The next morning, a memo circulated. Subject: temporary removal from external representation. Daniel's name was absent. Not mentioned, just missing. That was when it hit him. This wasn't about punishment, this was about trust. And trust, once withdrawn, rarely returns. Daniel stared at the screen until his eyes burned. He wasn't falling loudly. He was being quietly excluded. And there was no speech he could give to stop it. Daniel realized something was wrong the moment he walked into the conference hall. It wasn't obvious. No one pointed, no one whispered. It was subtler than that. People didn't turn toward him anymore. They turned past him. The annual industry summit had always been Daniel's stage. Panels, keynotes, networking receptions. This year, his name wasn't on the program. He told himself it was an oversight. But as he moved through the room, the truth became impossible to ignore. People greeted him politely, briefly, before drifting away. Conversations stalled. Eyes flicked toward others. Daniel wasn't being attacked. He was being bypassed. At the opening reception, Daniel approached a familiar group. "Hey," he said brightly. Smiles followed, then silence. Someone checked their watch. Another person excused themselves. Daniel stood there, holding his drink, feeling something tighten in his chest. This was what irrelevance felt like. Across the room, Elliot stood near the back, unnoticed, exactly where he preferred to be. He hadn't planned to attend the summit, but a client had requested his presence for a closed-door session on compliance frameworks. He didn't advertise it. He didn't need to. Elliot saw Daniel before Daniel saw him. Daniel looked smaller than Elliot remembered, not physically,
energetically. The panel discussion began. Daniel had expected to be asked to contribute. He wasn't. The moderator referenced frameworks Elliot had helped prove years ago without naming him. Daniel listened, jaw tight. This wasn't coincidence, this was curation. Later that evening, during a formal dinner, someone raised a toast. To integrity, they said. To accountability. Applause followed. Daniel felt exposed, though no one had mentioned him. He finally understood. Public consequences don't announce themselves. They surround you.
Daniel retreated to the terrace. He pulled out his phone and scrolled aimlessly. Likes had slowed, messages unread. He looked up and froze. Elliot stood across the terrace, speaking quietly with two executives. Calm, unhurried, present. Daniel hadn't seen him like that in years. Not needing approval, not hiding, just existing. Daniel approached before he could stop himself. "Elliot," he said. Elliot turned. Their eyes met. There was no anger there, only clarity. "You're here," Daniel said unnecessarily. "Yes," Elliot replied. Daniel gestured vaguely around them. "So this is what you do now? Watch me fall?" Elliot shook his head. "No," he said. "I came to work." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You're enjoying this." Elliot met his gaze steadily. "I'm relieved," he said. "There's a difference." Daniel's voice dropped. "You could have warned me." Elliot inhaled slowly. "I tried," he said, "for years." Daniel clenched his fists. "I loved you." Elliot nodded. "I know." Silence stretched. Daniel searched Elliot's face for regret. He didn't find it. That night, an internal announcement circulated quietly. No press release, no spectacle, just a notice. Daniel Hayes was being placed on indefinite internal assignment. No client-facing role, no leadership track. Effective immediately. Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at the email. He waited for anger, for outrage. What came instead was emptiness. He had spent years protecting his image, and in doing so, he had lost the one person who protected him when it mattered. Elliot returned home late. He removed his jacket and sat by the window. He felt no triumph, only finality. Because justice, when it's quiet, doesn't celebrate. It closes doors. Daniel sent one last message. "I don't know who I am without this." Elliot read it carefully, then replied, "That's the work you avoided." Daniel stared at the message. For the first time, no reply came to save him. Daniel didn't lose everything at once. That would have been easier. Instead, his world thinned, slowly, quietly, politely. The office still existed, his badge still worked, his calendar still filled, but with internal reviews, training modules, compliance check-ins. No clients, no visibility, no voice. People smiled at him in the hallway. They just didn't stop. At first, Daniel told himself this was temporary, a reset, a misunderstanding. He rehearsed explanations in his head, how he would reframe the narrative, regain trust, return stronger. But narratives require an audience, and Daniel's audience had moved on. Friends stopped inviting him out, not out of cruelty, out of uncertainty. Daniel had always been the one with access, the connector, the opportunity. Without that, people didn't know where to place him. Some sent texts saying, "Let's catch up soon." Soon never came. Daniel spent long evenings alone, scrolling through old photos, professional headshots, event snapshots, carefully cropped images where Elliot's presence had once been edited out.
Daniel stared at the empty spaces and felt something tighten. He had erased Elliot to protect his future. Now the future had erased him. Elliot's life, by contrast, expanded, not loudly, not dramatically, organically. Clients recommended him quietly. Projects came through referrals. People trusted his discretion. He didn't post about it. He didn't announce anything. He just lived.
One evening, Elliot attended a small dinner with colleagues, chosen family more than friends. Someone asked, gently, "How are you holding up?" Elliot considered the question. "I feel solid," he said after a moment, and it surprised him how true it was. Daniel tried therapy. The therapist asked questions Daniel wasn't used to answering. Who are you when no one is watching? What did safety cost you? What did you trade for approval? Daniel didn't know. That terrified him more than any career setback. Weeks later, Daniel ran into Elliot at a grocery store. No warning, no preparation, just proximity. They stood awkwardly near the produce section, the hum of refrigeration filling the space between them. Elliot spoke first. "Hi." Daniel nodded. "You look different," he said. Elliot smiled faintly. "So do you." There was no bitterness in it, just observation.
"I'm sorry," Daniel said suddenly. The words came out rough. "I didn't know how to say it before." Elliot studied him quietly. "I believe you," Elliot said. Daniel blinked. "That's it?" Elliot nodded. "I don't need more." Daniel felt something crack. He had expected anger, punishment, but forgiveness without reconciliation felt heavier. Daniel swallowed. "Do you ever miss us?" Elliot paused, then answered honestly. "I miss who I thought we could be." Daniel nodded slowly. That hurt more than rejection. They parted politely. No promises, no nostalgia, just closure. That night, Daniel sat alone and finally cried. Not for Elliot, for himself. For the years spent hiding. For the love he diluted until it disappeared. For the person he never let himself become. Elliot returned home and opened his windows. The city air felt lighter. He didn't feel victorious. He felt complete. Because reclaiming yourself isn't loud. It's peaceful. Time did what it always does. It clarified. Daniel's position at Hayes & Cole was quietly dissolved, not with termination papers, with options. A lateral move, a support role, an exit package framed as mutual. Daniel accepted the package. There was no fight left in him. The announcement was brief, professional, forgettable. And that was the hardest part. Daniel had once believed his absence would be felt. Instead, the firm adjusted seamlessly. Systems do that. People don't. Daniel moved into a smaller apartment, sold things he once displayed like trophies. He stopped checking social media, not out of discipline, but fatigue. Without the performance, he didn't know what to post. Elliot, meanwhile, received an invitation. Not flashy, not public. A leadership role within a firm that valued exactly what Elliot brought: discretion, foresight, integrity. He read the offer carefully. Not for prestige, for alignment. Elliot thought about Daniel, not with resentment, with understanding. Some people survive by being visible. Others survive by being true. He had tried to be both. It had almost cost him everything. Daniel attended a small community event weeks later. Nothing professional, just people. For the first time, he introduced himself honestly, without titles, without qualifiers. It felt strange and freeing.
Elliot accepted the role. He didn't announce it. He didn't celebrate publicly. He told a few people he trusted. That was enough. One evening, Elliot walked past the same rooftop venue. Again, different season, different crowd. He didn't stop this time. He kept walking. Some places only matter until they don't. Daniel sent one final message. "I'm trying to live honestly now." Elliot read it, then replied, "I hope you do." No lecture, no bitterness, no reopening, just closure. Elliot looked at his reflection that night and recognized himself fully for the first time in years. No shrinking, no waiting, no silence forced by fear, only peace chosen freely. Elliot learned something unexpected after everything settled. Silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. The new role fit him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Meetings were efficient. Expectations were clear. Trust was assumed, not negotiated. People listened when Elliot spoke, not because he was loud, because he was consistent. One afternoon, a junior colleague asked him, "How do you stay so calm under pressure?" Elliot smiled gently. "I stopped fighting to be understood by people who didn't want to see me." The colleague nodded, thoughtful. Daniel, across the city, adjusted slowly to a life without performance. He volunteered, read more, spent long walks alone. For the first time, he was learning how to exist without an audience. Some days were easier than others, but they were honest. Months passed. The industry moved on. Stories always do. But something remained, a quiet lesson passed in conversations Daniel would never hear and systems Elliot would never need credit for. Elliot attended a small gathering one evening, nothing formal, just laughter, food, warmth. Someone introduced him to a man, kind eyes, easy presence. They talked without pretense, no hiding, no editing. When Elliot left that night, he realized something quietly profound. He was no longer afraid of being seen. Daniel watched the city lights from his apartment balcony weeks later. He thought about Elliot, not with regret anymore, but gratitude. Elliot had shown him the cost of living half a life, and the relief of choosing differently. They never spoke again. They didn't need to. Some connections don't end in closure. They end in understanding. Elliot stood by his window one final time, not looking out, but in. He remembered the man who once negotiated his worth for peace, and felt compassion for him. That version of himself had survived long enough to make freedom possible. If this story moved you, subscribe, because quiet strength deserves space too. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone you loved, leave a comment below. You are not weak for wanting to be seen. You are human. Love that hides you is not love. Silence chosen out of fear is erasure. But silence chosen with self-respect, that is power.